Imagine standing in the middle of a blizzard on Christmas Eve, holding a suitcase that contains your entire life, and watching your own father lock the front door of your house while your stepmother smiles at you through the window. That was the moment my world stopped. My name is Maya, and just 3 hours ago, I was the senior analyst at Rossi Global, a billion-dollar company my grandfather built from the ground up. Now, I was a ghost in my own neighborhood, shivering in a thin sweater because I'd just given my last piece of warmth to a stranger who looked even more broken than I was. I didn't know it then, but in just a few hours, 19 black luxury SUVs were going to surround the roach-infested motel where I was hiding, and the truth they were carrying was about to change everything. Before we get into how I went from the gutter to the throne, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button, because the ending of this story is something you have to see to believe. The snow in Chicago doesn't just fall, it bites. It felt like thousands of tiny needles hitting my face as I stood on the sidewalk, my designer heels sinking into the slush. My father, Richard Rossi, stood on the heated marble porch of our family estate, his face twisted in a mask of cold disappointment. Beside him stood Beatrice, the woman he'd married 2 years after my mother died. She was draped in a white fur coat, her hand resting patronizingly on the shoulder of her son, Julian. Julian was my age, but while I had spent my life studying and working 80-hour weeks to prove my worth, Julian had spent his life figuring out how to steal mine. "Don't bother coming back, Maya," my father said, his voice flat and hard. "I can handle a lot of things, but I won't have a thief under my roof." Julian showed me the wire transfers. "You tried to siphon $5 million into a private offshore account. My own daughter, trying to bleed me dry while I'm still alive." "Dad, I didn't do it," I screamed, the wind catching my words and tossing them away. Julian framed me. "He has the passwords to the accounting server. Why won't you just look at the logs?" "I've seen enough," Richard snapped. He threw my suitcase down the steps. It burst open, my clothes spilling out into the gray mud. Julian smirked, adjusted his tie, and leaned in to whisper something to Beatrice. She let out a small, musical laugh that made my blood run cold. "You always were too emotional for the business, Maya," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with fake pity. "Maybe now you'll learn that life isn't a fairy tale. You're lucky your father isn't calling the police. Now, get off the property before we have security remove you." The heavy mahogany door slammed shut. The click of the deadbolt sounded like a gunshot in the quiet, snowy night. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door. I had no car. It was a company lease that Julian had already reported as stolen. I had no phone service. The family plan had been disconnected 30 minutes ago. All I had was $47 in my pocket and a suitcase full of wet clothes. I dragged my suitcase down the street, my body shaking so hard I could barely walk. I reached a small park a few blocks away. The benches were covered in a thick layer of ice, and the streetlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows over the snow. I sat down, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was 28 years old, a Harvard graduate, a top-tier analyst, and I was homeless on the most celebrated night of the year. I looked at the houses surrounding the park, their windows glowing with warm, golden light. I could see families sitting around dinner tables, kids opening early presents, and the flickering blue light of televisions. I had never felt more invisible. I thought about my mom. She would have fought for me. She would have seen through Beatrice's lies in a heartbeat. But she was gone, and my father was a man who valued results over feelings. If Julian produced a document that said I was a thief, then I was a thief. It didn't matter that I had saved the company 6 times in the last year. It didn't matter that I had stayed up all night for a month to close the Thorne merger. In my father's eyes, I was just dead weight that had finally been cut loose. The wind picked up, a vicious gust that went straight through my cashmere coat. I pulled it tighter, tucked my chin into the collar, and tried to stop crying. Tears just made your face colder. That's when I heard it. A soft, shuffling sound in the snow. I looked up, expecting to see a security guard or maybe a stray dog. Instead, I saw a woman. She looked ancient, her back hunched against the wind. She was white, maybe in her late 70s, with wild gray hair that was matted with ice. But what stopped my heart was what she wasn't wearing. She had no coat. She was wearing a thin, tattered floral dress that looked like it belonged in a summer garden, not a Chicago blizzard. And she was barefoot. Her feet were a horrific shade of purple blue against the white snow. "Oh my God," I whispered, standing up. She was stumbling, her legs shaking so violently she could barely stay upright. She didn't see me at first. She was staring at a trash can near the park entrance, her hands reaching out as if she were trying to warm them over a fire that wasn't there. "Ma'am," I called out. She turned slowly. Her eyes were glazed over, her lips almost gray. She looked at me, but it was like she was looking through me. She tried to speak, but her teeth were chattering so hard the words came out in broken pieces. "So CC cold," she rasped. "Please, help. I'm so cold." She took a step toward me and collapsed. I lunged forward, catching her before her head hit the frozen ground. Her skin felt like ice. Touching her was like touching a statue made of frozen meat. I've never felt anything so terrifying. She wasn't just cold, she was dying. Right there, in my arms, on Christmas Eve. I looked around desperately. "Help! Somebody help!" I screamed at the big, warm houses. Nobody came. A dog barked in the distance, but the windows remained closed. The world was at home, celebrating, and they didn't want to see the two broken women in the park. I looked down at the old woman. Her eyes were starting to roll back. I knew that if I didn't do something right now, she wouldn't last another 10 minutes. I looked at my coat. It was a $3,000 Max Mara coat, the only thing keeping me from the edge of hypothermia myself. If I took it off, I'd be down to a thin silk blouse and a light sweater. I looked at my suitcase. Everything in there was soaked from the slush. I had a choice. I could leave her and run to the nearest gas station to call 911, or I could give her the only thing I had left. My father's voice rang in my head. "Maya, you have to be selfish to survive. In this world, you're either the hammer or the nail." I looked at the woman's blue feet and her gray lips. I didn't want to be the hammer. I fumbled with the buttons of my coat, my fingers numb and clumsy. I stripped it off, and the cold hit me like a physical blow. It felt like someone had dunked me into a vat of liquid nitrogen. My lungs seized for a second, but I didn't stop. I wrapped the coat around the old woman, tucking it under her legs and pulling the collar up around her ears. I took my scarf and wrapped it around her frozen feet. "It's okay," I whispered, my own teeth starting to clack together. "I've got you. Stay with me. Please stay with me." I reached into my bag and found the half-eaten turkey sandwich I'd grabbed from the office fridge before I was kicked out. It was smashed and cold, but it was food. I broke off a piece and pressed it against her lips. "Eat. You need to eat." She opened her mouth slowly, her eyes fixing on mine. For a second, the fog in her gaze cleared. She looked at me with an intensity that made me shiver more than the cold did. She chewed slowly, swallowed, and then reached out a trembling hand to touch my cheek. "Why?" she whispered. Her voice was still a rasp, but the gray was fading from her lips. You have nothing. Why give to me?" "Because nobody should be alone tonight," I said, and a fresh wave of tears hit me. "And because if I can't save myself, I might as well save you." We sat there for a while, huddling together for warmth. I felt the heat leaving my body, my fingers going from painful to numb. I knew I couldn't stay there. If I stayed, I was going to die. I helped her sit up, her body wrapped in my expensive coat. "Can you walk?" I asked. She nodded weakly. "A little. There's a shelter, 3 blocks south. I'll walk you there," I said. It was the longest 3 blocks of my life. I was walking in my stockings because my heels were useless in the snow, carrying my heavy suitcase in one hand and supporting the old woman with the other. By the time we reached the brick building with the Mission of Mercy sign, I couldn't feel my feet anymore. I handed her over to a volunteer at the door. The volunteer looked at me, a black woman in a silk blouse, soaking wet, shivering uncontrollably, standing next to a beggar wrapped in a $3,000 coat. "Are you okay, honey?" the volunteer asked. "I'm fine," I lied, my voice shaking. "Just make sure she's warm. Please." The old woman turned back as they led her inside. She looked at me one last time. "Maya Rossi," she said. I froze. I hadn't told her my name. "How do you?" "I won't forget this," she said, her voice suddenly sounding stronger, deeper. "The world is a cold place, Maya. But you have a fire inside you. Don't let them put it out." She was gone before I could ask her how she knew who I was. I turned away from the shelter. I couldn't stay there. It was full, and they were only taking in the elderly and families for the night. I walked another mile until I found a motel that looked like it was falling apart. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, the sun set in. It was a place where people went when they had nowhere else to go. I paid $25 for a room. The carpet was stained, the heater groaned like a dying animal, and the blankets smelled like cigarettes and regret. I locked the door, pushed a chair under the handle, and collapsed onto the bed. I didn't even take off my wet clothes. I just curled into a ball and let the darkness take me. I woke up a few hours later to a sound I didn't recognize. It wasn't the heater. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming. It sounded like a fleet of engines idling outside my door. Then, the light hit. A bright, white spotlight cut through the thin, yellow curtains of my motel room, illuminating the dust motes in the air. I scrambled off the bed, my heart racing. Was it the police? Had Julian followed me? I crept to the window and pulled back the curtain an inch. My jaw dropped. The motel parking lot, which had been empty and dark when I arrived, was now glowing like a stadium. 19 black Mercedes-Benz SUVs were parked in a perfect semicircle around my room. Their headlights were on, cutting through the falling snow. Men in dark suits and earpieces stood in front of each vehicle, their hands clasped in front of them. The door to the center SUV opened. A woman stepped out. She wasn't wearing a tattered dress. She wasn't barefoot. She was wearing a tailored black suit and a coat that looked like it cost more than my father's house. Her gray hair was swept back in an elegant bun. She walked toward my door with the grace of a queen. It was her, the woman from the park. I stood there, frozen, as a heavy knock echoed through the room. Maya Rossi. The voice came from the other side of the door. It was the same voice, but now it carried a weight of authority that made the walls seem to vibrate. My name is Lady Eleanor Thorne, and it's time we talked about your future. I opened the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Eleanor stood there, holding my cashmere coat, neatly folded. You passed the test, Maya, she said, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. Your father thinks you're worthless, but I think you're exactly what this city needs. 19 SUVs are waiting. Are you ready to take back what's yours? I looked at the SUVs, then at the coat, and then back at the woman who had been a beggar just hours ago. I realized then that my life wasn't over. It was just beginning. Sitting in the back of a Mercedes-Benz Maybach feels a lot different when you have nothing left to lose. 6 hours ago, I was curled up on a stained motel mattress, shivering in the dark, and wondering if I'd even survive until Christmas morning. Now, the interior of the car smelled like expensive leather and old money. Lady Eleanor Thorne sat across from me, her presence filling the cabin like a silent storm. She wasn't the shivering old woman I'd met in the park anymore. She looked like a queen who had just reclaimed her throne, and the way she looked at me made me feel like I was finally being seen, not as a daughter, not as an analyst, but as a person with a core made of something stronger than steel. If you've ever wondered what it's like to go from being treated like a parasite to being given the keys to a kingdom, keep listening, because what Eleanor Thorne told me in the back of that car was about to blow the roof off the Rossi Empire. You're wondering how I knew your name, Eleanor said, her voice smooth as silk, but carrying a weight that made me sit up straighter. She didn't wait for me to answer. I've owned 51% of Rossi Global for 20 years, Maya. Your grandfather was a dear friend of mine. He was a man of integrity, a man who built a legacy on trust. But your father, Richard, has allowed a cancer to grow in that company. Beatrice and Julian aren't just family, they are scavengers. I've been watching them pick at the bones of your grandfather's work for a long time. You were testing the company, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical weight. The homeless woman in the park. You weren't just looking for a coat. You were looking for a heart. Eleanor nodded, her sharp blue eyes fixed on mine. Every year, on the anniversary of your grandfather's passing, I walk through the city as a ghost. I want to see if the world has truly gone cold, or if there is still a fire left in the next generation. I sat outside your father's building for hours. I saw how the security guards pushed people away. I saw how Julian spat on the sidewalk near a beggar. And then, I saw you. I saw you get thrown out, stripped of everything. And yet, when you saw someone with even less, you didn't hesitate. You gave away your only warmth. That, Maya, is why you were sitting in this car. Kindness without strength is just a weakness, but kindness in the face of total ruin? That is leadership. She reached into a mahogany cabinet in the side of the car and pulled out a thick leather folder. She slid it across to me. I'm giving you a choice, Maya. It's Christmas morning. I can give you $10 million right now. You can move to a beach in Italy, change your name, and never look back at the Rossi family again. You'll be comfortable for the rest of your life. I looked at the folder. $10 million. It was more than I'd ever had in my own name. It was freedom. It was safety. But then I thought about Julian's smirk as he threw my clothes into the mud. I thought about the $5 million he'd framed me for stealing. I thought about my mother's legacy being burned to the ground by a woman who only cared about the size of her pearls. And the second choice? I asked, my voice steady. Eleanor smiled, and it was a terrifying thing to see. It was the smile of a woman who had won 1,000 corporate wars. The second choice is the Thorne Forge. For the next 6 months, you disappear. You won't exist. You will live in a high-security facility I own in upstate New York. You will be trained by the best minds in forensic accounting, psychological warfare, and high-stakes negotiation. You will learn every secret your father's company is hiding. And at the end of those 6 months, I will send you back into that boardroom, not as Maya Rossi, but as M.E. Thorne, my personal representative and the lead auditor for the majority shareholder. They won't recognize me? I asked. By the time I'm done with you, you won't even recognize yourself, Eleanor replied. You'll be the hammer, Maya. And Julian? He'll be the nail. I didn't even have to think about it. I reached out and pushed the folder back toward her. When do we start? The next 6 months were a blur of pain, exhaustion, and absolute focus. The forge, as Eleanor called it, was a brutal, glass-walled bunker hidden in the woods. I didn't see the sun for the first 30 days. I was up at 4 a.m. every day for physical conditioning with a former Special Forces operative. He told me that if I couldn't control my own body and heart rate under pressure, I'd never control a boardroom. By 7 a.m., I was sitting across from a man who used to be one of the top interrogators for the government. He spent hours trying to break me, mocking my failures, and picking apart my insecurities until I had no more tears left to cry. Then came the real work. I spent 16 hours a day buried in the digital shadows of Rossi Global. Eleanor had given me access to backdoors in the server that Julian didn't even know existed. I learned that my theft of $5 million was actually a cover for a much larger operation. Julian and Beatrice were siphoning off tens of millions of dollars into shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. They were bleeding the company dry to fund Beatrice's gambling debts and Julian's failed tech ventures. But the most heartbreaking discovery was the state of my father. Richard Rossi wasn't just being manipulated. He was being neutralized. I found medical records and intercepted emails that suggested Beatrice was slowly drugging his evening tea with a powerful sedative that kept him in a constant state of mental fog. He wasn't choosing Julian over me because he wanted to. He was doing it because he couldn't think clearly enough to see the truth. The man who had locked me out in the snow was a shell of himself, a puppet with Beatrice pulling the strings. As the months passed, I felt the old Maya dying. The girl who wanted her father's approval was replaced by a woman who wanted justice. I learned how to read a person's tells, the way their eyes moved when they lied, the way their breathing hitched when they were cornered. I learned how to use silence as a weapon. Eleanor visited me once a month, watching from behind one-way glass as I tore through complex financial webs. "You're ready," she said on the final day of the 6th month. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I had lost weight, but gained muscle. My hair was a sharp, icy blonde bob instead of the long, soft curls I used to have. I wore a tailored suit that cost more than my father's car, and my eyes, they were cold. I looked like a thorn. I felt like a thorn. Julian has scheduled a board meeting for tomorrow morning, Eleanor told me as we flew back to Chicago in her private jet. He wants to be officially named as the successor to the CEO position. He thinks your father is too ill to continue, and Beatrice has managed to convince the minority board members that Julian is the only hope. They have no idea that I am exercising my right to an emergency audit. How are we playing this? I asked, looking at the city lights below. You walk in as M.E. Thorne, Eleanor said. The board knows I have a personal representative, but they've never met her. Your father will be there, but he'll be in a fog. Beatrice will try to charm you. Julian will try to intimidate you. Let them dig their own graves before you throw the first shovelful of dirt. The next morning, the lobby of Rossi Global felt like a tomb. It was the same building where I'd spent my childhood, the same building where I'd been escorted out by security 6 months ago. The guards didn't recognize me. They bowed slightly as I walked through the gold-rimmed doors, flanked by 4 of Eleanor's security team. I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes on the elevator. When the doors opened on the top floor, the air was thick with the smell of expensive cologne and desperation. Julian was standing near the coffee station, looking smug in a suit that was a little too flashy. Beatrice was beside him, looking every bit the grieving wife, her hand resting on my father's arm. My dad looked terrible. He was thin, his eyes vacant, staring at a spot on the wall. You must be the Thorne representative, Beatrice said, gliding toward me with a fake smile. I'm Beatrice Rossi. We were told to expect an auditor, though we weren't expecting someone so young. I didn't take her hand. I didn't even look at her. I walked straight to the head of the conference table and sat down. The room went silent. Julian's smirk faltered. I am M.E. Thorne, I said, my voice cold and flat, exactly the way Eleanor had taught me. I'm not here for pleasantries, Mrs. Rossi. I'm here because the majority shareholder has concerns about the 24% drop in liquid assets over the last 2 quarters. We're going to start this meeting now. Now hold on, Julian said, slamming his hand on the table. I'm the acting CEO. You don't get to bark orders in my house. My father is. Your father is the CEO until a vote is cast. I interrupted, finally locking eyes with him. He didn't recognize me. Not yet. He just saw a powerful woman who wasn't afraid of him. And based on the preliminary data I've already pulled from your servers this morning, Julian, you should be a lot more worried about the audit than who is sitting in which chair. What is that supposed to mean? Beatrice asked, her voice sharpening. I opened my laptop and projected a screen onto the wall. It was a list of wire transfers, the same ones Julian had used to frame me. But these had a new layer of data attached to them. It means, I said, looking directly at my father, trying to see if there was any spark of the man I loved still in there, that $5 million didn't go to a Rossi account. It went to a shell company called BJ Holdings. Does that sound familiar, Julian? Or should I show the board the signatures on the incorporation papers? Julian's face went white. Beatrice's hand tightened on my father's arm so hard he winced. The board members started whispering, looking at each other in confusion. That's a lie, Julian shouted. You've hacked our systems. This is a setup. I don't need to hack what I already own, I said, leaning back. As of 8 o'clock this morning, Lady Thorne has exercised her right to freeze all personal expense accounts linked to the company until this audit is complete. That includes yours, Julian, and yours, Beatrice. Beatrice stood up, her face twisted in rage. Who do you think you are? You come in here and insult us? Richard, tell her. Tell her she's overstepping. My father blinked, looking around as if he were waking up from a dream. He looked at me, and for a split second, I saw it. A flicker of recognition. A ghost of a memory. He looked at my icy blonde hair, my suit, and then he looked into my eyes. Maya, he whispered, his voice cracked and weak. The room went deathly silent. Julian froze. Beatrice looked like she had just seen a ghost. I didn't break character. I didn't let the tears fall. I just looked at the man who had thrown me out in the snow. Maya Rossi is dead, I said, the words cutting through the air like a blade. She died at a bus stop on Christmas Eve. I am M.E. Thorne, and the audit has just begun. Julian started to say something, but he was interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing. He looked at the screen, and I watched his eyes fill with genuine terror. He looked at Beatrice, then back at me. My card was declined, he stammered. The account, it's empty. It's not empty, Julian, I said, closing my laptop with a satisfying click. It's seized. And by the end of this week, the only thing you'll be owning is a jumpsuit with a number on the back. I stood up and walked to the door, but before I left, I turned back to Beatrice. She was shaking, her composure completely gone. Check your tea, Beatrice, I said, my voice a low, dangerous whisper. Because if I find one trace of those sedatives in my father's blood work, I'm not just going for your money. I'm going for your life. I walked out of the boardroom, Eleanor's security team falling in behind me. I could hear Julian screaming behind the closed doors, but I didn't stop. I went to the elevator, and as the doors closed, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding for 6 months. I wasn't the girl on the bench anymore. I was the hammer, and I was just getting started. But I knew Beatrice wouldn't go down without a fight. She had a lot of dark secrets, and she was about to play a card I never saw coming. You won't believe what I found in my father's medical files that night. Walking out of that boardroom was the hardest thing I've ever done. My father's cracked voice calling my name felt like a physical hand pulling at my heart. but I couldn't turn back. Not yet. If I broke character now, Beatrice would find a way to spin it. She would tell the board I was an imposter or a mentally unstable daughter seeking revenge. I had to stay Thorne. I had to be the cold, calculated machine that Eleanor had built in the forge. I walked through the lobby of Rossi Global, the clicking of my heels on the marble sounding like the countdown to a bomb. Eleanor's security team surrounded me, their faces like stone, as we pushed through the glass doors into the humid Chicago afternoon. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears, and all I could think about was the vacant, cloudy look in my father's eyes. He wasn't just old, he was being erased. When the heavy door of the SUV closed, sealing out the noise of the city, I finally let my shoulders drop. Eleanor was already inside, watching a live feed of the boardroom on her tablet. She didn't offer a hug or a word of comfort. She just looked at me and said, "You missed one." "What?" I asked, my voice still sounding like the icy auditor I'd been playing. "The board chairman, Miller. He didn't blink when you mentioned the shell companies. He knew," Eleanor said, tapping the screen. "Beatrice didn't just buy Julian. She bought the gatekeepers. You've drawn blood, Maya, but a shark doesn't die from one scratch. It just gets more aggressive." I saw my dad. I whispered, the cold professional mask finally slipping. "She's killing him, Eleanor." I could smell the chemicals on him. "It's not just sedatives. He's fading." "Then we moved to phase 3, Eleanor said, her voice turning dark. "If we're going to save Richard and the company, we have to stop the source. But Beatrice isn't going to sit around and wait for the next meeting. She knows you're Maya now. And a woman like that, when she's cornered, will burn the whole house down just to keep the insurance money." That night, I didn't go back to the hotel. We moved to a safe house, a high-rise penthouse owned by a shell company that even Julian couldn't trace. I spent the hours between midnight and dawn staring at the medical files Eleanor's team had intercepted from my father's private physician. The doctor was on Beatrice's payroll, receiving consultation fees that were 10 times the standard rate. As I scrolled through the digital charts, I saw it. The prescription wasn't for a standard sedative. It was a cocktail of low-dose neuroleptics and a rare beta blocker that, when combined, created a state of controlled dementia. It made the patient suggestible, sleepy, and unable to form complex thoughts. It was a chemical lobotomy. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I remembered my mom's voice, telling me that Dad was a lion, that he would always protect us. Now, the lion was in a cage built of pills and tea. I called Eleanor's lead medical consultant, a man who had worked for the Thorne family for decades. "How long does he have?" I asked. "At this dosage, his heart will hold for a few more months, but his mind, if we don't get him off that cocktail in the next 72 hours, the neurological pathways will start to permanently degrade. He won't be Richard Rossi anymore. He'll just be a body." The clock was ticking. I had to get into the Rossi estate. I had to get a real blood sample and replace his medication with a neutralizing agent Eleanor's team had prepared. But the estate was a fortress. Julian had doubled the security after I was kicked out, and Beatrice had installed a new system with facial recognition. "I'm going in," I told Eleanor the next morning. "It's a trap, Maya," she warned. "Beatrice is waiting for you to play the daughter. She wants you to break into that house so she can call the police and have you charged with home invasion. It would ruin the audit's credibility." "I'm not going in as the daughter," I said, looking at the ice-blonde hair in the mirror. "And I'm not going in through the front door." 2 hours later, I was in the back of a delivery van, dressed in the uniform of a high-end floral service. Beatrice loved fresh lilies. She had them delivered every Tuesday morning like clockwork. I had a small, high-tech kit hidden in the bottom of a vase of white lilies. Inside were a needle, a vacuum vial, and a bottle of clear liquid that looked like water but was actually the antidote. The gates to the estate opened with a hum. I felt my stomach flip as we drove up the long, winding driveway. This was the home where I'd learned to ride a bike. The home where I'd sat by the fireplace with my mother and read books. Now, it felt like a prison. The van stopped at the service entrance. A guard checked my ID, a fake that Eleanor had perfected, and waved me through. I moved through the kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs. The staff was new. Beatrice had fired all the old maids and cooks who had been loyal to my mother. I reached the grand hallway and saw my father sitting in his favorite armchair by the window. He was staring at the garden, his hands limp in his lap. Beatrice was nowhere to be seen. I walked toward him, my breath hitching. "Dad," I whispered. He didn't turn. He just blinked slowly. I set the flowers down on the side table and knelt beside him. Up close, his skin looked like parchment. I reached for his hand, and for a second, his fingers twitched. "I'm here, Dad. It's Maya," I said, my voice shaking. I worked quickly. I took the small needle and drew a vial of blood from his forearm. He didn't even flinch. I felt a tear hit my hand, and I realized I was crying. I wiped my eyes, pulled out the neutralizing agent, and poured it into the half-full teapot sitting on his tray. "Drink this, Dad. It's going to make the fog go away," I whispered. I was just about to pack the kit when I heard the sharp click of heels on the hardwood floor. I froze. "I told the guards no lilies today," a cold, sharp voice said. I stood up, pulling the floral cap low over my eyes, but it was too late. Beatrice was standing in the doorway, her eyes narrowed. Behind her stood Julian and two large men I didn't recognize. "The auditor," Beatrice said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. "Or should I say the thief? You really couldn't stay away, could you, Maya? You just had to come back and play the hero." "I'm here to save my father from the woman who's poisoning him," I said, standing tall, my icy blonde bob catching the light. Julian laughed, stepping forward. He looked at the vial of blood in my hand. "Poisoning? You've been watching too many movies, sis. What you have there is a needle and a vial. In the eyes of the law, that looks like an assault on an elderly man with a diminished mental capacity. It looks like you're the one trying to hurt him." "I have the medical records, Julian," I said. "I know about the offshore accounts. I know about the BJ Holdings funds." "Records can be deleted," Beatrice said, stepping into the room. She looked at my father as if he were a piece of furniture. "And witnesses can be bought. But a video of the disgraced daughter breaking into her father's home to inject him with an unknown substance? That's forever." She pointed to the corner of the room. A small, red light was blinking on a hidden camera I hadn't seen. "Julian, call the police," Beatrice said. "Tell them Maya Rossi is back, and she's finally lost her mind." The two men behind her moved toward me. I backed away, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the vial. I knew Eleanor was watching through the GPS tracker in my uniform, but she was miles away. I was alone. "You won't get away with this," I said, but even to my own ears, the words sounded weak. The men grabbed my arms, twisting them behind my back. The vial of blood fell to the carpet, but it didn't shatter. The thick rug cushioned the impact. Beatrice walked over, picked it up, and tucked it into her pocket. "You were always the smart one, Maya," Beatrice whispered, leaning close to my ear. Her breath smelled like mint and cold steel. "But smart people die every day. It's the ruthless ones who survive. You gave your coat to a beggar and thought it made you a saint. All it did was make you cold." The police arrived 10 minutes later. It was a setup, perfectly timed. They didn't listen to my talk about Thorne or the audit. They saw a woman in a fake uniform, a needle on the floor, and a sobbing stepmother claiming I tried to kill her husband. I was handcuffed and let out of the house I grew up in, while Julian filmed it on his phone, laughing. I was thrown into a cold, gray holding cell at the precinct. The irony wasn't lost on me. 6 months ago, I was at a bus stop. Now, I was in a cage. I sat on the metal bench, staring at the wall. My mind was racing. If I stayed here for 24 hours, the neutralizing agent I'd put in the tea wouldn't be enough. Beatrice would find it and dispose of it. She'd increase the dose. I looked up at the security camera in the corner of the cell. I knew Eleanor was watching. I knew she had a plan. But for the first time, I felt a flicker of real doubt. What if Beatrice was too fast? The cell door creaked open an hour later. I expected a lawyer or a detective. Instead, it was Julian. He had a smug look on his face, his hands tucked into his pockets. He gestured to the guard, who walked away, leaving us alone. "Nice suit, Maya," Julian said, leaning against the bars. "Thorne really did a job on you. You almost looked like a real person in that boardroom." "Get out, Julian," I said, my voice dead. "Oh, I'm going. But I wanted to give you the news first. Since you're indisposed, the board has called an emergency meeting. Beatrice convinced them that your attack on Dad proved that the Thorne audit was a hostile takeover attempt by a mentally unstable relative. They voted to skip the audit and move forward with the sale." "Sale?" I sat up. "What sale?" "The Rossi Group is being bought by Global Dynamics," Julian said, his eyes gleaming. Beatrice and I are selling the entire legacy for $6 billion. We signed the papers in 2 hours. By the time you get out of here, the company will be gone, the estate will be sold, and Dad will be moved to a private care facility in Switzerland where nobody will ever see him again. My blood ran cold. You're selling your own grandfather's life work? You're selling your father. I'm cashing out, Maya, Julian said. Something you were too ethical to do. While you were playing hero in the snow, I was playing the long game. Enjoy the sell. It's the only home you have left. He turned to leave, but I stood up, walking to the bars. Julian, I called out. He stopped and looked back. You think you're the hammer, I said, my voice low and steady. But you forgot one thing Eleanor taught me. What's that? He sneered. A hammer is only useful if it hits the right nail. And you, I pointed at him, have been hitting the air for 6 months. I reached into the hem of my fake uniform and pulled out a small, flat device. A digital recorder Eleanor had hidden there. I pressed play. Julian's voice filled the small cell. I was playing the long game. I'm cashing out, selling the entire legacy. Beatrice and I are selling. Dad will be moved to a private care facility where nobody will ever see him again. Julian's face went from smug to ghostly white. You recorded me? The Forge didn't just teach me how to read books, Julian. It taught me how to bait a rat, I said. Eleanor has been live streaming this entire conversation to the board members and the lead investigators at the SEC. Every word you just said about the sale, about the embezzlement, and about hiding our father is now public record. The precinct buzzer sounded. The cell door clicked open. Not for Julian, but for me. Eleanor Thorne walked down the hallway, flanked by the chief of police and a team of federal agents. Maya Rossi, Eleanor said, looking at me with a pride that made the last 6 months of pain feel worth it. Your father is being moved to a Thorne medical facility as we speak. The neutralizing agent is working. His mind is clearing. She turned to Julian, who was trembling so hard he couldn't speak. And as for you, Mr. Rossi, Eleanor said, handing a warrant to the police chief. You're going to find that the private care facility in Switzerland is much harder to get into than a federal prison. Handcuffs clicked onto Julian's wrists. He was dragged away, screaming for his mother. I stepped out of the cell, my suit wrinkled, my hair a mess, but my eyes were like diamonds. Is it over? I asked Eleanor. Not yet, she said, checking her watch. The emergency meeting to sell the company starts in 40 minutes. Beatrice is already at the boardroom. She thinks she's about to sign the papers and become a billionaire. Eleanor handed me my cashmere coat, the one I'd given to her in the park. It had been cleaned and pressed. Put it on, Maya, Eleanor said. It's time to show the world that the fire you started in the snow is about to burn down the Rossi boardroom for good. We headed for the SUVs. But I knew Beatrice wouldn't go quietly. She was a scorpion, and she still had one final sting left. You won't believe the trap she set for the final meeting. The sound of 19 engines idling in unison is a low, vibrating growl that you feel in your teeth before you hear it in your ears. I sat in the back of the lead SUV, staring out at the blurred lights of Chicago, clutching the cashmere coat Eleanor had returned to me. This coat was once the only thing I had left in the world. Now, it was a reminder that the coldest night of my life was the one that finally set me on fire. My father's life, my grandfather's legacy, and the future of thousands of employees were all hanging by a thread that was exactly 20 minutes long. Beatrice was in that boardroom right now, her pen hovering over a contract that would sell our soul to the highest bidder. She thought she had buried me in a jail cell, but she forgot that when you bury a seed, it doesn't just die, it grows. If you've ever been counted out, stepped on, or told you weren't enough, you need to hear how this ends. Because the moment I walked through those double doors, the Rossi family was about to find out that the daughter they threw away was the only one who knew how to save them. The elevator ride to the top floor felt like it took a lifetime. Eleanor stood beside me, her silhouette reflected in the polished chrome doors. She didn't look like a billionaire. She looked like an act of God. She reached over and adjusted the lapel of my coat. Her touch was brief, but it carried more motherly warmth than Beatrice had shown me in years. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. The Forge had taught me that the loudest person in the room is usually the weakest, and right now, I was the quietest I had ever been. When the door slid open, the noise of the executive level hit me. It was frantic. Assistants were running with papers, Lawyers were huddled in corners whispering into phones, and the air smelled like ozone and expensive stationery. They didn't even see us. We walked past the reception desk, Eleanor's security team creating a silent, impenetrable wall behind us. I could see the main boardroom at the end of the hall. The frosted glass was etched with the Rossi crest, a lion holding a sword. My grandfather had chosen that symbol because a lion only uses its sword to protect the pride. Beatrice was about to use it to kill us. I pushed the doors open. The room was filled with the heavy hitters of Global Dynamics and the remaining board members of Rossi Global. Beatrice sat at the head of the table, looking radiant in a deep purple dress, her signature pearls glowing under the recessed lighting. She held a gold fountain pen in her hand, the cap already removed. Julian's chair was empty, a silent testament to the fact that he was currently being processed into the county jail system. But Beatrice didn't look like a grieving mother. She looked like a woman who was about to win a lottery worth $6 billion. "I believe we are all in agreement," Beatrice said, her voice smooth and practiced. "With Julian, indisposed due to his unfortunate legal misunderstandings, and my husband's tragic mental decline, I am exercising my power of attorney to finalize this sale. We are moving toward a brighter, more profitable future. The only thing you're moving toward, Beatrice, is a life sentence," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a shard of ice. The pen in Beatrice's hand stuttered, leaving a dark blotch of ink on the multi-million-dollar contract. She looked up, her face draining of color as she saw me standing in the doorway. She looked at my icy blonde hair, my tailored suit, and the cashmere coat draped over my shoulders. Behind me, Eleanor Thorne stepped into the light. The board members gasped. Everyone in the business world knew Eleanor Thorne, but almost nobody had ever seen her. She was the phantom of the market, the woman who could crash a currency with a single phone call. "Maya," Beatrice hissed, her eyes darting toward the security guards. "You're supposed to be in jail." I finished for her, walking slowly to the table. "Julian was the one who ended up there, Beatrice. He couldn't wait to brag about your plan. He told me everything. How you drugged my father. How you siphoned the funds. How you planned to dump my dad in a facility in Switzerland where he'd never be heard from again. This is madness," Beatrice shouted, standing up and looking at the representatives from Global Dynamics. "This woman is an imposter. She's my stepdaughter. She's mentally unstable. Security, remove her immediately." The security guards moved forward, but Eleanor Thorne simply raised a single finger. Her team stepped into the gap, and the Rossi guards froze. They knew who signed their checks, but they also knew who owned the building. "The majority shareholder has a statement to make," Eleanor said, her voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "And I suggest you all sit down and listen, because the next 10 minutes will determine whether you go home to your families or to a federal holding cell." I opened my laptop and connected it to the massive wall monitor. I didn't show them spreadsheets this time. I showed them the footage from the jail cell. Julian's face was huge on the screen, his smug voice filling the room. "Selling the entire legacy. Beatrice and I are selling. Dad will be moved to a private care facility where nobody will ever see him again." The room went deathly silent. One of the board members, an older man who had known my grandfather, looked at Beatrice with pure disgust. "But that's just the beginning," I said. I pulled up the medical report. "This is my father's toxicology report from 2 hours ago. The Thorne medical team found high levels of neuroleptics and beta blockers, substances designed to simulate dementia. Beatrice has been poisoning the CEO of this company for 18 months. It's a lie," Beatrice screamed, her voice hitting a high, hysterical note. "He's old. He's failing. I was protecting him." "No," a new voice said. The door at the back of the boardroom opened. My father, Richard Rossi, walked in. He was leaning on a cane, and he looked thin, but his eyes were clear. The glassy, cloudy look was gone. He looked at Beatrice, and for the first time in my life, I saw the lion my mother had described. "Richard," Beatrice whispered, her hand going to her throat. "The antidote works quickly, Beatrice," my father said, his voice stronger than I had heard it in years. "It turns out, when the fog clears, it's very easy to see who was standing in the shadows with a knife." He looked at me, and his eyes filled with tears. He walked toward me, his steps shaky but determined. I didn't move. I couldn't. The woman who had been trained to be a machine in the forge felt like she was 5 years old again. He reached out and touched my face, his thumb brushing away a tear I didn't know I had dropped. "Maya," he whispered. "I locked the door. I locked you out in the snow. Can you ever?" "We'll talk about that later, Dad," I said, my voice cracking. "Right now, we have a company to save." My father turned to the board. "The sale is canceled. Beatrice Rossi is stripped of all authority and power of attorney. And as the CEO of Rossi Global, my first official act after my recovery is to name my successor." He looked at me and then at Eleanor. Eleanor nodded once. "Maya Rossi is the new CEO of Rossi Global," my father announced. Effective immediately. Beatrice lunged for the contract, trying to tear it, to do something, anything, to reclaim the power that was slipping through her fingers. But the federal agents were already there. They had followed us from the precinct. Handcuffs clicked onto her wrists, the sound final and cold. As they led her out, she looked at me with a hatred so deep it should have burned. "You think you've won?" she spat. "You're just like them, Maya. You're a shark now. You'll die alone in a high-rise just like your father." "Maybe," I said, looking at her as she was dragged away. "But at least I'll be warm." The room cleared out. The Global Dynamics team left in a hurry, their lawyers already drafting statements to distance themselves from the scandal. The board members offered their apologies, but I didn't want them. I wanted them to go home and think about how they had let a woman poison their leader while they counted their stock options. I sat in the big leather chair at the head of the table, the same chair I had seen my grandfather sit in when I was a little girl. Eleanor sat to my right, and my father sat to my left. "What now?" my father asked, looking at me with a mixture of pride and shame. "Now we rebuild," I said. "We find the money Julian stole. We fix the reputation you let slip. And we change how this company does business." 6 months later, the Rossi building looked different. The cold, sterile gold-rimmed decor was gone, replaced by art from local galleries and spaces that felt open and alive. I was the youngest CEO in the city's history, but nobody questioned my authority. They had seen what M.E. Thorne could do, and they knew better than to test Maya Rossi. Julian and Beatrice were awaiting trial. The evidence was insurmountable. My father was living in a quiet house in the suburbs, recovering his health and spending his days at the medical foundation I had started in Eleanor's name. We were talking again. It wasn't perfect, and the scars from that Christmas Eve would never fully heal. But for the first time in years, the air between us was clear. It was Christmas Eve again, a year to the day since I had stood in the snow with a suitcase. I walked out of the Rossi building, the snow falling softly over the city. I wasn't in stockings this time. I was wearing sturdy boots and my old cashmere coat. I told my security team to stay back. I wanted to walk. I walked toward the same park where I had met Eleanor. The ice was back, the streetlights flickering in the same eerie rhythm. I saw a bench near the entrance. Sitting there was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 20. She was wearing a light denim jacket, shivering so hard she looked like she was vibrating. A small backpack sat beside her. I stopped. The memory of the cold hit me, the way it makes your bones feel like they're made of glass. I walked over to her. She looked up, her eyes wide and terrified. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she whispered, her voice shaking. I'm just waiting for a friend." I didn't say anything. I just reached into my pocket and pulled out a business card. It was a special card, one that gave the bearer immediate access to the Thorne Rossi Emergency Housing Center, a project I had built with Eleanor's help. I took off my cashmere coat. It was warm, the silk lining holding the heat of my body. I stepped forward and draped it over her shoulders. "It's a long night," I said softly. "You're going to need this more than I do." The girl looked at the coat, then at me. Her eyes filled with tears. "Why? You don't even know me." "I was you once," I said. I handed her the card. "Call the number on there. Tell them Maya sent you. They have a warm bed and a hot meal waiting. And don't worry about the friend. You found a better one." I turned and walked away into the snow. As I reached the edge of the park, I saw a black SUV waiting for me. Eleanor Thorne was standing by the open door, watching me. "The cycle continues," she said, a small smile on her face. "It's the only thing worth keeping," I replied. I looked back at the girl on the bench. She was wrapped in the coat, looking at the card, a flicker of hope in her eyes. The fire I had started in the snow wasn't just for me. It was for everyone who had ever been told they were worthless. I got into the car, And as we drove away into the quiet, snowy night, I finally knew that I wasn't just the hammer, and I wasn't just the nail. I was the architect of something new. And for the first time in my life, I was truly, finally home. If you believe that a single act of kindness can change the world, let me know in the comments. And remember, the next time you see someone in the cold, don't just look away. You never know whose life you might be saving, or whose empire you might be starting. Thanks for being part of Maya's journey. I'll see you in the next story.